Hello, genealogists. This is Craig with Just Genealogy, and today, as promised, a long one. What I'm going to talk about today is the French and Indian War. So researching your French and Indian War ancestor. And I'm going to try to take it from both sides, from both the British side, the French side, and the Native American side. See what we can do. That's why it's so long. Colonial wars are an interesting part of our history. What's neat for me is that many of the soldiers who fought in the French and Indian War and then later in Lord Dunmore's War would either go on to serve in the Continental Line in the American Revolution or their kids would. It actually was the first global war. It was everywhere. We called it the French and Indian War, but the British and French called it the 7 Years' War. In spite of the fact it lasted 9 years, they just forget the part that started out in North America. It started here, and we'll talk about that. And although there already was a 9 Years' War, so they couldn't have the second 9 Years' War, so they called it the 7 Years' War. And besides, people in Europe weren't paying any attention to what was going on in North America anyway. Not really. Battles not only occurred on the American frontier, but in places like India and the Philippines. George Washington was so embarrassed by his actions, which we'll talk about, which precipitated the war, that he began to learn how to become a better military officer, and it paid off a couple of decades later. So our goal today is to learn how to properly research a participant in this colonial war in colonial records. Now, one of my favorite books to deal with in regards to colonial wars in North America is Alan Galloway's Colonial Wars of North America, 1512 to 1753 from Garland Publishing. It's unfortunately long out of print, but if you can find it, it's worth having. It's unfortunately very expensive on Amazon. You have to ask the question, why war? What was it all about? Was it about gold? No. Was it about riches? Not really. It was about one thing. It was about land. There were a bunch of colonial wars, and this is only the short list. The Battle of the Severn was the end of the Glorious Revolution. There were the Anglo-Dutch Wars, King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, King William's War, the War of the League of Augsburg, that's the other name for it, the War of Queen Anne's War in 1701, that's the War of Spanish Succession. There was Culpeper's Rebellion in North Carolina. There was the Tuscarora War, where they used the Yampsee to fight the Tuscarora, and then after that war was over, the Yampsee went back home to South Carolina, where there was a war, and they pretty much were wiped out. The War of Jenkins' Ear, some ship captain, British ship captain, kept his ear in a jar for 7 years. Different story. But because of the War of Jenkins' Ear, militia went from the colonies and fought at the Battle of Cartagena. And the admiral that lost the battle there, his name was Vernon. And Mount Vernon is named for him because Augustine Washington was there. And we know about those people because we have ration reports at the name level from the Royal Navy when they fed these people. Then there's King George's War in 1744, the War of Austrian Succession. Then we have the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, also known as the 7 Years' War. Then after that, we have Pontiac's War. Pontiac didn't get the memo that the war was over, so he tried to keep going. Then in North Carolina was the War of Regulation. That really wasn't against Native Americans any more than the Battle of Severn was. And then there's Lord Dunmore's War in 1774, the pretend first battle of the American Revolution. The first Anglo-French War, King William's War, or the War of the League of Augsburg, also called the 9 Years' War, was primarily fought in North America in the St. Lawrence and Upper Hudson area and in Acadia. The Second Anglo-French War, which was Queen Anne's War, which was 1702 to 1713, was the War of Florida, the War of Spanish Succession, and it was fought in Florida and New England, so on the tips of the colonies. The Third Anglo-French War was King George's War, 1744 to 48. It was the War of Austrian Succession. It was everywhere in the colonies. Robinson's Virginia militia joined 3 Maryland companies and 2 New York companies. I think it is under General George Clinton, who we would see several years later when he came to New York during the American Revolution. And these people all headed for Canada, but before they got to Canada, the war was over and they came back home. The Fourth Anglo-French War is the 7 Years' War, aka the French Indian War, and it's fought from Acadia to Fort Niagara, down the Ohio and the Monongahela Rivers into Pennsylvania, and then there's also some action in the South. There used to be, at the Smithsonian, a marvelous exhibit called Clash of Empires, which dealt with the British, French, and Indian War. I visited it a couple of times when it was in D.C. It's now at the Heinz Museum, or at least pieces of it are at the Heinz Museum in Pittsburgh, and if you can get there, it's worth going to see. So let's talk about what we need to understand. We need to understand the war. We need to understand the organizations that prosecuted the war and the records that were created by the war. So we need a search strategy. This is basically my process for researching an ancestor in any war. The war, the organizations, the records, and the search strategy. So this is a view of the world in the 1750s. This is the French view. Notice how the colonies are sort of tiny, stuck up against the mountains, not going anywhere. This, however, is the British view of the colonies at the same time. You sort of get the idea that there had to be some clash of empires because we have 2 different views about what the world looks like. What's interesting is how much land Virginia has. Looks like it's up into Michigan. It's also interesting to see that Pennsylvania really looks strange. And New Jersey looks like it lost the top of its head. Massachusetts pretty much looks like Massachusetts has always looked. And notice, no Vermont. So there's several pieces to this time period. There's the Ohio expedition, the Celeron expedition in 1749, where the French lay out what land they think belongs to them. There's the Ohio Company of Virginia that decides that they want the land that the Ohio expedition just identified as belonging to them. There's the Battle of Fort Necessity. There's the Great War Pass. There's the backcountry. There's stuff in Canada. There's, in fact, a global war. And then finally, there's the Treaty of Paris that ends it all. So the Ohio expedition, or Celeron expedition, is in 1749. And they drop off these tablets along the Ohio River. And they create a map that tells us where all the tablets are. And some have been found. I know that one was found at Point Pleasant. And there's a marker to it behind the building at Point Pleasant. And I think a couple of others have been found also, although I don't know which one, where they were found or where they are. I just know about the Point Pleasant one. The Ohio Company is a land speculation company, and Thomas Lee is the president, Nathaniel Chapman is the treasurer, John Mercer is the secretary and general counsel, George Mercer is the agent in England, Lawrence Washington is president after the death of Lee, and Augustine Washington Jr. is involved, as is Governor Dinwiddie. Now you recognize some of these names. All the Washington people are relatives of George. Lee is, of course, part of the Lee family. So these are all aristocratic Virginians, for the most part. At the same time that that's going on, there's the Loyal Company, and it's organized by Thomas Walker and Peter Jefferson. Now, Peter Jefferson is Tom's dad. And in 1748, the British Crown approved the Ohio Company's petition for a grant of 200,000 acres near the forks of the Ohio. I guess you would call that Fort Duquesne then, or Pittsburgh today. In July 1749, Virginia made the grant on the condition that within 7 years, 100 families would settle in the area and erect a fort. The French aren't going to like this. So they will hire Christopher Gist, who knows that area very well, to explore the Ohio Valley in order to identify lands for potential settlement, and his journals have been published by Heritage Books. The governor of Virginia determines, that would be Dinwiddie, to send George, as in George Washington, up to Fort Duquesne to tell the French to get out of Dodge. He gets up into Pennsylvania, and he's got interesting guides who are not really on his side. And one of those guides convinces him that the French are about to attack him, so George decides to attack first, and the Indian kills the French ambassador who's on his way to Virginia. Not a good time for George. George realizes that a terrible mistake has been made. He backs down the path a little bit to a place that will soon be called Fort Necessity, and builds a palisade. And you notice in this picture's hanging on the wall in the Heinz Museum in Pittsburgh, where that display is for the Clash of Empires. And you'll notice that these people are dressed pretty fancy. That's because these are regular British Army troops. There is a company of British Army troops with George, under the command of George, believe it or not, and a captain by the name of Mackay. You'll notice there's two sets of white tents in the background. One side is the regular army camp, the other side is the Virginia militia camp. They didn't get along. When it's all said and done, after Washington and Mackay have been surrounded by about 600 French and Indians, and they think there are a lot more, they surrender, and this is the surrender document. It's in French. I don't know whether George knows French or not, but I think he can assume that the word assassination is on this piece of paper and that he admits to causing the assassination of the French diplomat. Notice Mackay signs above George's name, almost. And then Colonel Villery is the French person. So what we've introduced here is a stockade. Well, in this time frame, there are three kinds of forts. There are forts. These are the strongest type. They're generally built under the direction of the Executive Council of a state. So something like Fort Duquesne, which would become Pittsburgh, Fort Pitt, is something built by the government. A stockade is not usually built by the government. It's usually just a large log house with a palisade. The palisade is those logs stuck in the ground upright. And then there's the blockhouse. Some of those blockhouses look like mushrooms with an overhanging second story. And others just simply had slits in them so that you could slip a rifle through it and fire without getting hit by somebody else. There are forts spread out all over everywhere. There are several websites that deal with forts. One is called The Backcountry, and Fort Edwards has put together a listing of frontier forts, and you can get to that rather easily. Now, in order to create forts from the perspective of the government, you have to have laws that create those forts so the money can be appropriated. So in Henning's Statutes of Large, you will find that they are establishing a chain of forts to begin at Henry Enoch's on the Great Cape Capon in the county of Hampshire and to extend to the South Fork of the Mayo River in the county of Halifax. And this is not what the fort looked like. This is the visitor center where the fort was today. The remains of the fort really aren't there anymore. There is a battle nearby on the 18th of April, 1756, where Washington's Virginia Regiment is ambushed. It's also known as Mercer's Massacre, as Captain Mercer and 16 of his 60 men are killed. It's a joint French-Indian force of 100. There's also a battle on the Upper Track, and it was entrusted, the Upper Track Fort was entrusted to Captain James Dunlap, and the Indians captured and burned the fort, killing 22 persons, including Dunlap himself. And information on that event on the 27th of April in 1758 is found in the History of Pendleton County, West Virginia. And you can find that in Google Book, or you can also find the History of Pendleton at heritagebooks.com. There's Fort Seybert, and this shows you, and the only reason I mention it is it gives you an example of both a palisade, another word for palisade is stockade, a palisade and a mushroom-look building kind of fort. Not quite much of a mushroom. There also is a website on North American forts that also deals with the Canadian forts. And they are done by territory, and they get updated quite a lot. And the forts that you're going to be most interested in this time period are the Quebec forts, because there's really not much in Ontario at the time. You'll also find that, you'll notice here that René Chartrand is a pretty prolific guy when it comes to writing about Canadian stuff and military stuff, period, for that matter. So he's always an author that you're going to want to look for. He publishes a lot with Osprey Publishing out of the United Kingdom. There also is NorthAmericanForts.com. They have an east side and a west side. You'll be interested in the east side because those are east of the Mississippi. And here we see Fort Ashby, which is a stockade located on the east bank of Patterson's Creek on the site of the village of Alaska, formerly Frankfort, Mineral County. That would be West Virginia today, erected by company men commanded by Lieutenant John Bacon in 1755 and named for Captain John Ashby. One of the buildings erected is the only remaining structure of its kind in West Virginia, dating back to the frontier posts of defense. Then there's one called Evans, which is located at the head of Big Spring in Berkeley County, erected in 1756. So most of the North American forts that anybody knows about on the east side of the Mississippi River can be found here. Now, for the war, there are lots of sources. There's the Osprey book on the 7 Years' War. That's the British version of what the war looks like. Then there's the French and Indian War by Schwartz. I love it because it's full of maps and pictures. There is the Encyclopedia of the French and Indian War in North America, 1754 to 1763 by Stotzel. It is thick and expensive, of course. And it is probably the best nuanced, detailed book on pieces and people of the French and Indian War. We have lots of other books dealing with the war, particular history of the French and Indian War, reminiscences of the war, the Black Watch at Ticonderoga, the history of the French War, Braddock Road Chronicles, and a history of the Mississippi Valley. The war extends all the way into the Mississippi Valley. There are books about forts. There are books about Rogers Rangers. We have a 4-volume set done by Loescher that is the go-to for Rogers Rangers. We also have books on the ranging service and how Rogers' rules of the ranging service have been integrated into other things, even modern things. You'll find county things such as Neglected and Forgotten, which is Fauquier County in the French and Indian War. Then you'll find Freemen, Freeholders, and Citizen Soldiers that talks about Joshua Bagley's regiment. And then we've got Kuntz's book on the Virginia frontier. One of my favorite books is a thesis, actually. Most of my favorite things are actually theses. The Effects of the French Indian War on Civilian Life in the Frontier Counties of Virginia, 1754 to 1763. This book was published by the Virginia Genealogical Society, and it gives insight into how the Quakers, specifically living in Frederick County, reacted to the war and how they retrogressed back into Loudoun, Fairfax, and Alexandria. And then, of course, when the war was over, they would come right back. Quakers are not exactly a very good buffer when it comes to Native American incursions into civilization. A couple of good books, Breaking the Backcountry by Ward and At the Edge of Empire by Hinderaker and Mancall are probably the two best books on what the world is like on the frontier. There are also books about French soldiers. La Marine is the story of the member of the French Marine Infantry during the war. The French Marine Infantry, interestingly enough, wears white. I will show you that later on. Then there's the memoir, The French Indian War Soldier, Jolicoeur Charles Bonnin. And then we've got 3 books on officers, Leading by Example by Bob Baer, talking about the partisan fighters and leaders of New France. A couple of books by Chartrand are French Fortresses in North America, and then Tomahawk and Musket, which deals with French Indian raids in the Ohio Valley in 1758. Timothy Kent has done some work on the fur trade during this time and rendezvous and those kind of things, which may be of interest to you, and the forts involved in those kind of things. The war extends all the way into Wisconsin in the Northwest, of course, and there is Louise Phelps Kellogg's book, The French Regime in Wisconsin and in the Northwest, that you might find helpful. There also is historical fiction by Brenton Kemmer. War, Hell, and Honor and The Partisans are both novels of the French Indian War. Books about Pontiac's War are also available. Probably the best one is Defenders of the Frontier by Kenneth Stewart, and it talks about the Royal American Regiment and what it did to end Pontiac's War. Whenever I'm dealing with a war, I always go to the Center for Military History to see what they have to say, and they have a section that relates to the French and Indian War. And if you just Google Center for Military History, French and Indian War, it will show up. So what do you need to know? You need to have knowledge of the person. You want to know their full name. You want to know what their age is, because there are age things. If you're under 18 and over 60, you're not going to end up in the militia. There are also persons who are exempted from the militia, and basically Henning Statutes of Law in Virginia is what will tell you that. And basically the laws in the statutes in any colony will tell you what the ages are for militia duty and who is exempt. And basically anyone who in Virginia who is the bona fide overseer of 4 servants or slaves is exempt. I think it gets to 20 by the Civil War. You want to know their place of birth, because there are some muster rolls that will tell you place of birth. You want to know their residence before, during, and after the conflict, because it will allow you to distinguish between others of the same name, and it will also allow you to know that you're dealing with the right person because they're living in the right place. Now, there are several kinds of service. Somebody could have been in the British Army, ends up retiring and stays here. That happens to some people. They could be part of Colonial Forces, much like George is. They could be a member of the militia. They could be a sailor or Marine, although these are likely to be British sailors or British Marines or French sailors or French Marines. And they could be Native Americans, and the Native Americans are going to be serving on both sides. So when you look at the organizations, on the British side, we see the British Army, the Colonial Militia, the County Militia, and the Native Americans. And on the French side, we see the French Army, the French Marines, the Colonial Militia, and the Native Americans. If you're dealing with the British Army, you want to know what regiment they're in. I always recommend that you start with In Search of the Forlorn Hope by John N. Kitzmiller II. This is probably the best book for locating British Army records. It's actually a 3-volume set, and it's linked very closely to the Family History Library in Salt Lake City in regards to especially its 3rd volume, where it gives you the roll numbers of the film that's in the Family History Library. If you're dealing with Highlanders, those are going to be playing in Georgia and the South, and the Scotch Highlanders in America by MacLean will address that for you. I'm just going to go through a listing of units and places to give you some idea about the extent of British involvement in the French and Indian War and why it was so expensive and why eventually it becomes a problem paying for it, and how it eventually leads to the American Revolution. So in Canada, we have several British regiments that are there for many, many years. In the American colonies, they're stationed in places like Albany, Alexandria, Virginia. They're in the Alleghenies. They're in the Blue Mountains. They're in Boston. There's the Battle of Bushy Run. They're in the Carolinas. They're in Charleston. They're part of the Cherokee Indian Expedition. They're at Chestnut Ridge. They're in Connecticut. They're in Detroit. They're in the Cherokee Campaign. They're in Florida. The list goes on and on. Fort Niagara, Fort Loudon, Fort 96, Fort Pitt, the Jerseys, Lake Champlain, and then Monongahelia's defeat. More. New Jersey, New York, New Haven, 96, Pensacola, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, all those places. Then we have the Native Americans. And for the most part, the Native Americans that are involved in the French Indian War are Abenaki. And there is, in fact, Daniel Gookin in 1792 gives a treatise on the historical collections of the Indians in New England, which you can get through Haiti Trust, which is an interesting read if you're interested really in that time period. He wrote it in 1792, but it deals with the period of the French and Indian War. The Abenaki, during the 7 Years' War, there was a group called the St. Francis Indians, and they fought on the side of the French, as did other Abenakis, but those in New England remained neutral. Some even supported the English. The St. Francis Indians, however, conducted numerous raids on English settlements and became known as the French Indians. And the people they were fighting were the Colonial Militia. Their job pretty much was to do nothing more than protect the home. You don't see them moving around very much, although they from time to time will. There are several state-level texts that deal with the militia and the colonial forces. There's a couple of books on roles of Connecticut men in the French and Indian War. There is a description of what's going on with the Virginia and the French and Indian War by Carruthers. The HistGen has published a couple of books, old books, very old books, relating to Massachusetts officers in the French Indian War and Massachusetts soldiers and officers in the French Indian War. David Gose has done a lot of work on the French Indian War in Massachusetts. Another book is Lois Horowitz's A Bibliography of Military Name Lists from pre-1675 to 1900. If you can find it, unfortunately, it's out of press. I wish they would bring it back into press for us, because it is so useful. I refer to it often when I'm dealing with this time period. I'm always going to look, if I'm dealing with Virginia, in Boxstruck's Virginia Colonial Soldiers. It's available from us, published by GPC, and is also on Ancestry, as are some Virginia colonial records, as is Hamilton Ecker Road's special report of the Department of Archives and History in 1913 that deals with Virginia colonial soldiers. That's on Ancestry. The other place I'm going to look is Murdy June Clark's Colonial Soldiers of the South. Now, and it's on Ancestry. It's also available in book form. There's another book by Crozier on Virginia county records that deal with the Virginia Colonial Militia, and it, of course, is also on Ancestry, because they're old family tree maker CDs. I always like to go to the Wiki on Family Search, and there is a wiki, of course, for the French and Indian War, and it deals with things at the state level in both British America and New France, and also it deals with the Native Americans, whose side they were on, and that kind of stuff. So there is the Plains of Abraham Museum out there, and it's supposed to have reopened its doors, but there is a database of soldiers, French and British Army soldiers in Quebec. There is a wiki for Colonial Militia in Canada. All these are the kind of things that you want to look for. Whenever you're looking at a wiki, of course, you're going to want to look at the references for sure. Maybe not pay so much attention to what's going on inside the wiki itself, but the references are important. So you also need to know about captains, colonels, battles. Did they survive the war? Were they a prisoner? Those kind of things. There are books about battles. There are even movies about battles. Spencer Tracy, Northwest Passage, is actually the St. Francis raid. Monongahela, Washington's defeat, Braddock's disaster is out there. This is a side note in the 7 Years' War. It's not really a big deal. In the histories of the 7 Years' War, I've seen it have one line. There is Braddock Road Chronicles by Andrew Wall. That's an excellent book on all the pieces associated with what's going on in 1755. You're going to want to look at state archives for muster rolls, bounty land, and other records. Some of the muster rolls are available on the Library of Congress website, especially in the George Washington papers. And here you'll see, here's Captain Cox's Rangers. I always like to go to the original because if you look in both Murdy June Clark and you look in Boxtruck and you look at James Wood there, the second name, above his name is the word sergeant, but that word does not, it's an abbreviation there, but that neither appears in Boxtruck or Clark. So you always want to search down the original. In Henning Statutes at Large for Virginia, there is militia schedules for each and every county almost. And many of these name troopers and officers by name. So here is Captain Lewis Elsey's company, pretty much from Fairfax. And he names his field and staff and also names the troopers. Those that are, and also there's a servant to Lewis Elsey mentioned there also. So here's what it is for Culpeper. It's not as many names, but still the officers and the sergeants appear to be identified. Here's Prince William County, and it mentions troopers. So again, we have individual names of people who are part of the militia. Hampshire County. Now these in Hampshire County are not people. These are people providing support during the French Indian War in the form of corn or wheat or steers, beeves, those kind of things. For Pennsylvania, most of what you're going to be able to find in regards to names is out there on Pennsylvania archives. It's disjoint in a variety of different volumes and series of Pennsylvania archives. I got tired of fooling with it before it ended up on Fold 3. So I, for myself, wrote Officers and Soldiers in the Service of the Province of Pennsylvania, 1744 to 1764, in order for me to be able to get to names more quickly because I was having to go through the books. And then I decided, well, I might as well publish that. Although I published it after Fold 3 came into existence, you still have the problem of missing something on Fold 3. There is bounty land in the war, but it's an interesting story. The King's Proclamation of 7 October 1763 provided land to those individuals who fought in the war. 50 acres to a private, 5,000 acres to a major or a colonel, 3,000 acres to a captain. And you can find the names of those individuals in Kentucky land warrants. There also is a publication called French Indian War Land Warrants by Taylor. Basically, his Kentucky Land Warrants book combines Samuel Wilson's Revolutionary War book with Taylor's French and Indian War book. There also is some information on these land grants out in the Library of Virginia, so it's a good place to go to. There is a downloadable finding aid, a research note number 20 to the Virginia Land Office that will also help you with these. There is correspondence during the war. William Shirley is a governor up in New England at that point in time, and he writes a lot. And then there are the Amherst papers. These are from the southern sector. Amherst is in charge of the war in the colonies. The northern section has been published is in Great Britain. The southern sector we published here. There also are newspaper accounts. There's 5 volumes of newspaper accounts. None of the pictures that you see here have anything to do with the French and Indian War. They mostly look like Hessian soldiers, and I've never been able to figure out how Hessian soldiers ended up on the cover of a publishing company like me, but it happened before my time, and I just haven't got the strength to go and change it. But there are 4 that deal with the period of the war and 1 that deals with after the war. There are also many captive narratives in this time frame, and they're kind of cool. So the most famous ones are Coleman and Baker, and those are New England captives, but there are also Pennsylvania captives available. The name Nehemiah Howe comes to mind, but there are others. There are some specialized repositories, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, not our National Archives, but the National Archives as in TNA and Q, and that would be in London, England, and then the American Antiquarian Society. So you can just go to the Library of Congress and plug in French and Indian War. It probably will lead you to the Peter Force Library, where there's a manuscripts and maps relating to American history, and they deal with that time period. So you can find some pieces relating to, for example, this is a journal of an unidentified provincial soldier in New York. Then there is the papers of Caleb Stark, who is I think he's the nephew of General John Stark, who's both a general in the French Indian War and also the Revolution. He was at the Battle of Burlington, if I have my thoughts in proper order. So I think Caleb is his nephew, and basically he writes about John Stark in both places. In the National Archives UK, you will find that it operates much the same way as our own archives in regards to having documents available online. We're going to be interested in the Colonial Office and the War Office. So you will find reports and those kind of things that are available online. Not very many, but a few. The American Antiquarian Society has a manuscript collection that deals with the French and Indian War, and Heritage has published, it's a rather old book of what they hold in their manuscript records collection. There also are state manuscript collections, and basically you can just Google the state. What you're looking for is state archives. You're looking for state historical societies, like here in Massachusetts, and it has maps of the French and Indian War. Vermont doesn't even exist in the French and Indian War, but it has stuff related to the French and Indian War. The Rhode Island has pieces. New York Historical has pieces. And they have a good number of manuscripts that deal with the French and Indian War. American Ancestors, HistGen, New England Historic Genealogical Society, their databases will also be helpful in locating a New England soldier and might be helpful in locating a Virginia soldier, given that they also have the Virginia Genealogist online there. Something we also have on CD. Individual histories of towns will provide information on the French and Indian War. This one is on the military history of Medway, and it talks about the inhabitant soldiers in the French and Indian War, and other wars for that matter. I have a brother that lives there. State-level treasury records will get people paid, and you'll find because they're being paid, there has to be some sort of statute, and heading statutes at large, volume 7 is where you're going to deal with those. There are also maps, pre-federal maps in the National Archives. There's an annotated list of those that's available. My favorite atlas is the Atlas of Early American History, and it has, it's easy to remember who it's by because there was the Battle of Capon, and this is by Lester Capon. So one of the maps that comes out after the war basically shows you where British troops are stationed after the war. And you can see they're all the way out there in St. Louis. They're down there in Pensacola. They're in Fort Duquesne. They're all over the place. And there's just a lot of British soldiers are in North America at the end of the war. And they cost money. There is a French Indian War rendezvous. Actually, there's more than one. They're all over the country. But the Fort Chartres one is one of the bigger ones, and it's usually in the beginning of October. You can see here these people wearing white. Those are people in French Marine uniforms. The fort is in the background. That fort is not where the fort was during the French-Indian War. I think it's been relocated 3 times. And in spite of being relocated 3 times, it flooded the last time the Mississippi River flooded to a great extent. So keep moving it away from the river. And here's another shot of those French Marines. They wore white. Can't believe it. So your search strategy is going to be knowledge of the person, knowledge of the family, knowledge of the service, state and local records, manuscript records. Don't forget the National Archives in Q, TNA, and don't forget maps. So a little longer than usual, but this has been Craig from Just Genealogy, converting people doing genealogy into genealogists day by day. I hope you've enjoyed this. I have. And I will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is Book Sunday, and 22 books came in this week. It will be so much fun to talk about them. Thank you so much.